joining us today. All of us at Siphon are very excited about what's going on here. My name is Greg Siphon. I am president of Siphon Logistics, which means I need to talk about Siphon for at least 1 minute. We have just turned 6 years old last month. Our biggest and most important asset has grown to over 178 team members. We're moving in excess of 1,000 loads a week with two major things in mind: picking up and delivering on time, and communicating both the good news and the bad news throughout the whole process. We focus every day on bringing value to our transportation partners, and that's what this webinar is all about. I met John at the DAT Symposium in California earlier this year, and he did a wonderful job speaking to us about the ELDs and the changes this was going to bring throughout our industry. You may ask questions through the chat feature on this webinar, and at the end of John's talk, he will answer all that time will allow. I also wanted to let you know that John is on retainer with our company, so if you don't get all your questions answered, or if you have some new ones, you can just contact myself, and I'll put you in touch with John free of charge. Take it away, John.
All right, I want to welcome everybody to this webinar. The focus of this is ELDs as it relates to the shipper and the receiver, as the title talked about. This slide right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a brief introduction on myself. Real quick, I used to be a state patrol inspector for 12 years, so I actually sat at a scale and worked the roads and pulled trucks over for full compliance of all regulations, not just hours of service. I did that for about 12 years. I became an investigator with the federal government for about 8 years, where I knocked on company doors and did full reviews of their transportation compliance. I was actually on the ELD implementation team when it was called EOBRs, which we're going to get to in a minute. Done a lot of good things in the industry, and now I'm a transportation consultant hired on by Siphon with a retainer to help answer any of your questions as we transition over the next 3 months. I'm also a guy that works for an insurance brokerage firm. I sell trucking insurance to trucking companies. But enough about me. Let's get into why you came to the webinar. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to try to make this webinar as interactive as possible. There's a chat function in the bottom corner of your screen. If you have any questions at all, go to the chat function, just type in your questions. At the end, we're going to answer those. So now what are we going to talk about for the next 45 minutes or so? We're going to talk about a history of the ELD, right? We're going to talk about a history because you can't really make informed decisions about your operation if you don't know where we came from as it relates to the ELD. Then we're going to talk about who's subject. As a general rule, who needs these things? And on top of who needs these things, who's accepted from putting them in? And there's a lot of people taking advantage of these exceptions. Then we're going to talk about something called the coercion rule. Now, this is of utmost importance for shippers, receivers, and even brokers, because it's a new rule that came out about 1 year and 3 months ago that reaches out to shippers, receivers, and brokers, where FMCSA might actually investigate them to make sure that compliance of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations are met. We're going to get into this in more detail in a little bit. And again, that's not to scare you. Siphon did not set up this webinar with me so we could scare shippers into thinking they're going to have liability issues. What we're trying to do is educate you so you can make decisions to make your business and your operation more effective before, during, and after the ELD rule, right? So we're going to talk about how ELDs work. Again, how are you supposed to make informed decision about ELDs if you don't understand how the data is flowing through the system? How does the motor carrier react with the ELD? How does the driver interact with the ELD? Those are things we're going to bring up. What do shippers and receivers need to know? Now, this rule is like 162 pages long in a Federal Register. Ultimately, we want to make sure you understand the pieces of that rule that most affect shippers and receivers. We're going to have a series of webinars later in the month where we're going to focus on motor carriers and that implementation, so I welcome you to come to those at the end of the month. But this one, shippers and receivers. Then we're going to talk about CSA. People on the call, do you know what CSA is? CSA is a scoring system where the federal government ranks carriers based on their performance during roadside inspections and during compliance reviews. Now, after all that, what can your freight broker do to help? What can Siphon do to help you move forward as this mandate comes into effect potentially, which we're going to talk about potentially because there are some things about extending the deadline, et cetera, that we're going to get into. So now, with this slide, you have an overview of what we're going to discuss over the next 40 minutes or so. So now, before we get into the meat of the presentation, let's not forget why. Why are the ELDs in place? FMCSA wants to reduce crashes and save lives. We want our freight delivered on time, in proper condition, but as safely as possible. The reason for the ELD mandate is for that safely as possible piece. So what do we talk about? This right here is a driver. He's a guy that went to work one day. Investigators found that he had fallen asleep and had driven more than 9 hours over federal rules. Now, when I do driver meetings, I ask drivers all the time, I say, hey, who thinks 9 hours over federal rules is a lot? And they say, wow, that is a lot. Then I say, okay, drivers in the room, who has ever shortchanged your 10-hour break? What I mean by that is between 2 work days, a driver needs to have 10 hours off. There are times, and I'm not saying how frequently, there are times where a driver will say in his paper logbook he took 10 hours off, but it really wasn't 10. It might have been 8 or 9, but he stretched it to make it look like 10. Well, if you drive today and you shortchange your 10, meaning you don't take 10, and you drive all day tomorrow, that would be 11 hours of driving today, 11 hours tomorrow. If you crash at the end, you'd be 11 hours over your federal rules. So then when I explain it like that and ask a driver's like, oh, man, I think I have shortchanged my 10-hour break in my career, so I was kind of in the position of him. So now, if a driver makes a bad decision, think about that. Who suffers? People suffer. Our neighbors, our friends, our family. So these 5 people lost their lives because he had chosen to drive over hours. One of the family members was quoted as saying, 1 second of him falling asleep, and we will suffer the rest of our lives. That driver had pleaded guilty to an 8-year prison sentence at the time. So think about that. This driver actually went to jail because he made a bad decision as it relates to the hours of service. People paid with their lives. So as we get through, does it affect capacity? What can a shipper do? Drivers want to stay in compliance. Let's not lose focus as to the meaning of why the ELD mandate is truly here in the eyes of the government and citizens in the country, I guess. So now, history. How do we make decisions and how do we understand the whole dynamic of the ELD rule if we don't understand where we came from? So 1988 was the first computer in a truck keeping track of driver hours of service. In 1988, it was voluntary. The rule in 1988 was called AOBRD, Automatic Onboard Recording Device. Right? So that rule in 1988. Now, I want you to go back to 1988 and think about what the Internet sounded like in 1988. And I'm going to give you an example. The older people on the call will get it. The younger people may not, right? Right? So that's the sound of like a dial-up modem. In 1988, that was the Internet, right? So the current rule we have right now, as I speak to you on the phone, is called the AOBRD rule, which was written in 1988. Crazy that it was that long ago. Then 19 years later, they came out with EOBR1. EOBR was interesting because it had enhanced technical specifications, and it was only going to mandate electronic logs, electronic onboard recording devices, for companies that had a bad compliance review, i.e., ones with a conditional or unsatisfactory rating. So this rule actually became final in 2010. And I say, wow, 22 years after the first rule, we finally got a second rule called EOBR1 mandating a new type technology device for, let's quote, say, bad carriers. Well, then they came out with EOBR2 a year later as a proposed rule and said, wow, instead of just doing it for the bad carriers with their conditional and unsat rating, let's do it for everybody. The problem is right in between here, OIDA sued the federal government because the government did not address driver harassment properly when they wrote EOBR1. So EOBR1 was vacated in August 2011, but they had already proposed a rule to make EOBR1 devices mandated for everybody. Now we have a problem. How do you mandate a device that no longer has a rule as a base? So what the government did in 2012, 24 years after this rule, they had listening sessions. They added EOBR1 and EOBR2 together, had a supplemental rule, listened to the country about driver harassment, then proposed a new rule in 2014. Well, right around this time, the government, meaning the U.S. Congress, came out with something called MAP 21, which you shippers and receivers may not understand, but it's when a broker surety bond went to $75,000, right? That's one of the things in MAP 21. The other thing is it mandated ELDs be put into place. Basically, at this point, because the last rule was 1988, Congress said, we're going to mandate these EOBRs, but they changed the name to ELDs. We're going to mandate ELDs in all trucks under a House Appropriations bill. So then they pushed it out, and finally, in 2015, after all this history, we came out with the ELD mandate. So we're about 18 months in. We got just about 6 months left, maybe even 4 months left, right, before the mandate comes. And just recently, in this little box right here, which is a box of uncertainty, that's why nothing's written here, we have two things right now in Congress. One is called the ELD Extension Act of 2017, which they're proposing a 2-year delay. The other one will be under the THUD bill, which is the next appropriations bill like MAP 21. They're trying to attach a rider to delay it also. But we can't predict the future. We don't know what the Extension Act is going to say. We don't know what the THUD bill is going to say. They don't have a lot of traction right now, but they just came back to session, so we don't know. As of right now, what I can tell you, as I speak to you on the phone today, we have a mandated requirement where you either need an AOBRD, an automatic onboard recording device, or you need an ELD, one of those two. So you need a device or an ELD, which is the new technology, in every truck in the United States by December 2017, unless exempt. So I'll say it again. You need one or the other. You either need the old device, AOBRD, or an ELD in your truck by this December, unless there's an exception nationwide, right? So now, there's a grandfather to that, though. If you put an AOBRD in your truck, before this December, you can actually continue to use the old devices, the AOBRDs, until 2019, December 2019. So you can use AOBRDs for 2 years. The only problem is you can't grow your fleet. You can't add another vehicle unless you take an AOBRD out of an old one. So it's kind of a temporary fix, right? But either way, you need to have one or the other in there unless accepted, right? Now, before we get into the exceptions, what kind of vehicles are we talking about? The reason I put a picture of a dually pickup truck here is because a commercial motor vehicle for hours of service in interstate commerce starts at 10,001 or more pounds, actual weight or GVWR. So if you open up this door, the GVWR, if it's more than 10, or if you put something in the back of this truck and it weighs more than 10, it's subject to hours of service, which means you need an ELD in this dually pickup truck if you're in commerce, furtherance of a commercial business in interstate commerce, unless exempt, right? Now, I keep saying you need these ELDs unless exempt. There are 3 major exceptions right now. The first one is you're a short-haul driver. A short-haul driver basically means you leave and return to the same spot. You stay within 100 air miles for CDL trucks, 150 air miles for non-CDL trucks. But this isn't an hours of service lesson, so I'm going to give you one of the short-haul exemptions. We're going to go through the 100 air mile radius exemption. If a truck, dually pickup truck or larger, all the way to tractor trailer, operates within 100 miles from the original work reporting location, that's first question. Number 2, they leave and return to the same spot and go home within 12 hours. Number 3, they get 10 hours off between their shifts. They don't drive more than 11 hours in this 12-hour period. And they have time records showing the time you start, time finish, total hours worked. If a driver in the United States answers these 5 questions correctly on a daily basis, they don't need a log for that day. So let's just go through hypothetically. Over a 30-day period, let's pretend a driver meets these questions correctly all the time. That means 0 days they needed a logbook. As long as they don't need a logbook more than 8 days, they're exempt from an ELD. So at the end of a 30-day period, if they don't ever need a logbook, they don't need an ELD. At the end of the 30-day period, let's say they answer these questions improperly 7 times. Well, 7 is 8 or less. So they still don't need an ELD. But let's say the next 30 days they answer these questions wrong 11 times. Well, 11 is more than 8, so they need an ELD in the vehicle for the whole 30 days. So if companies can manage their short-haul exceptions, they can get out of the ELD mandate. Next one's drive-away, tow-away. This is a brand-new truck, that's a brand-new truck, that's a brand-new truck. The government said, why install an ELD in a brand-new truck so once you deliver it, you just yank it out? You can deliver these under paper logs. The last one, and this has gone back and forth. A lot of people learn this early on as model year, meaning if it was a 1999 model year or older, it was exempt. Recently, in the last couple months, they changed it to engine year. That's to accommodate a lot of the glider kits that are out there, where you might have a 2015 truck with a 99 engine. Those are now exempt because they're using the engine year as an exception. So you never have to put an ELD in a truck with a 99 or older engine. So now, what have we talked about? We've talked about who's subject. We talked about what vehicles are subject. We know a little bit of the history of the ELD. We talked about the exceptions, the 3 exceptions. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of why a shipper and a receiver really need to care, right? From a regulatory standpoint. We already talked about the rule getting thrown out due to driver harassment. Driver harassment only addressed the hours of service, and it's really a motor carrier can't harass a driver. One of the provisions in the ELD mandate is requiring that the driver be able to mute any voice overlay when they're in sleeper berth or off-duty status. So they can't be bothered with noise when they're not working. But there's this other rule that is not connected to the ELD. A lot of people are unaware of it, and this is a big piece of why we put this webinar together. It's been in effect since January 29, 2016. It's called the coercion rule. The coercion rule has its own federal register. It applies to motor carriers. Well, that's common for regulations to apply to motor carriers, but it also applies to shippers, receivers, and transportation intermediaries, which is brokers. Hold the phone a minute. I've been an investigator for 20 years. I've been doing DOT consultant for another 3 or 4 or 5 after that. Over 20 years in this industry, I can't think of a situation where the federal government, FMCSA, would have an investigator investigate the actions of a shipper, receiver, or broker as it relates to all of the hazardous federal motor carrier regulations. Not just hours of service, but drug testing, hazardous material, vehicle maintenance. Basically, what does this rule say? It says that if a shipper, receiver, or broker makes a threat to a driver to violate any regulation that you see on the bottom, which includes hours of service, but hazmat and maintenance, you could be violating the coercion rule. Now, one other piece to it is you have to withhold, take, employment, or work opportunities from the driver, meaning the driver has to have lost some kind of work opportunity or some kind of business ability because you coerced him into violating. So that's one little caveat that we're going to get into. So basically, if you threaten a driver as their shipper, receiver, or broker to violate any rule of the regulations and you withhold business or take work opportunity, you are potentially subject to the coercion rule. Now, let's get into these terms. Receiver or consignee. Receiver is someone who takes delivery. A shipper is someone who tenders property. A transportation intermediary, a broker or a forwarder, is someone who arranges for the transportation. Coercion's prohibited, meaning a shipper, receiver, or a broker may not coerce a driver. Let's get into some more detail. Before we get into the last piece about filing a complaint, let's use a real-life example. Now, what are we trying to do at this webinar? We're trying to make you guys shippers of choice. We're trying to make it so shippers and receivers on the call do what they can do to improve policies and procedures to become a shipper of choice. Being a shipper of choice makes you attractive to motor carriers in an industry that is potentially facing a capacity crunch because of the ELD and a shortage of drivers. So, on the phone, I challenge you. Do you want to be a shipper of choice, or do you want to have drivers with illegal logs and not be a shipper of choice? So, first example, legal log shipper of choice, real case scenario. Driver starts working at 4 a.m. in his logbook, right? 14-hour period is his workday. He cannot drive after 14 hours, which 4 a.m. to 6 p.m. here. He cannot drive after 6 p.m. or he's illegal because that's 14 hours. Now, in this, he can't drive more than 11 hours. Well, he's only at 10, so he's good. So now, here's the scenario. let's say this shipper here, gives the driver a delivery time of 2 o'clock. The driver drives, takes his required 30-minute break, drives, gets to your location right at 2 o'clock, does exactly what you wanted him to do. And you're a good shipper, and you get him you get him unloaded. Let's say you get him unloaded within an hour. Then he drives for a half an hour, does his little post-trip inspection, makes it at this time. He's legal. He takes his 10 hours off. You accommodated a driver because you're a shipper of choice. That driver got there when you told him to. You got him in and out of there. He was still within his legal limits and made it to the truck stop up here, let's say, a half an hour from your location. Now let's talk about a shipper, not a shipper of choice. Same scenario, leaves at 4, takes his same break, gets there at 2 o'clock. Both of these are at the same pace. But this shipper with loaded freight holds him up for 5 hours. Now we have a problem, right? So this shipper who loaded the driver, he's loaded now. 5 hours later, he gets loaded. Now we have a choice. If you make him leave as a shipper at 7 o'clock at night, he's in violation. If the driver objects and you force him to, you coerce him to, will he lose work opportunity? Well, the answer is yes. If you make him leave loaded, he'll have to drive illegal right here, then do his post-trip, then start his break. But this is 5 hours he can't get back. He loses this 5 hours of work opportunity. If he was able to stay at your location, he could have actually just gone until midnight and then left your facility. He's already been at your facility for 5 hours. Why can't you just let him stay for another 5 hours? But if you force him to leave over hours, you're potentially subject to the coercion rule. So in these two scenarios, we want to be a shipper of choice. Now, what options do we have if this occurs? Let him stay, or, which we're going to discuss personal conveyance in a minute, let him drop his trailer or leave it at the dock. Let him leave his trailer at your facility. Take a spotter truck and go park it somewhere, right? Then he can potentially drive personal conveyance for the half an hour to the truck stop, and it'll actually be off-duty personal conveyance. So he can run personal conveyance off-duty, then take his time at the truck stop, continuing this 10 hours off, which we're going to get into personal conveyance in a minute. Personal conveyance is where you can drive your truck off-duty if you meet certain requirements. So before we move on to the next slide, shipper of choice, not a shipper of choice. Get him in and out of there. He'll be legal. They'll be happy to come back to you. Hold him up for 5 hours. He'll be illegal. You're subject to the coercion rule potentially. You could allow him to stay or run personal conveyance if you meet all the criteria. So that's a good example of how the coercion rule could play out at your company. Now, if the driver feels that he's been coerced, he files a complaint with the federal government under federal regulation, and the federal government might come knock on a shipper's, receiver, or broker's door and say, here's the facts of the circumstance that we just explained here. What do you have to say about it? I'm telling you right now, and Siphon is in the same boat, we want shippers and receivers and even brokers and even motor carriers to all work together to bridge that communication gap so we can all be more efficient in the wake of the ELD mandate, and so we don't end up subject to this coercion rule, right? One other thing you can do, and I forgot to talk about it here, is when they get here at this 2 o'clock p.m. point, if you know you can't get them in and out of here timely, then turn them away and tell them to go to the truck stop right here and come back tomorrow. That would also reduce your potential subjectivity to the coercion rule. If you know you're going to end up loading him and then he's going to be over hours by the time he leaves, look at his logbook when he arrives, his electronic log, and see if you can accommodate him within the times allowed. So, now that we talked about the coercion rule, again, not to scare you, just to make you educated, right? ELDs. You've heard the term. You can spell ELD because it's an acronym. That's a joke for everybody on the phone. All right? So I'm even telling jokes and laughing at myself because interaction on a webinar is tough to do, right? So what makes up an ELD? The government calls it EMCT, Electronic Mobile Communication Tracking Technology. Really, it's GPS, right? So GPS is one major component. The next component is the engine. The next component is drivers and carriers interact with the device. To give you a better example, now, we're not promoting mixed telematics or OmniTrax or PeopleNet or whatever. We're just using this as the slide of one of the devices that's available in the industry to give you an idea, right? So inside this truck is the engine. This is like the computer brain of the device. This is a fob where the driver can actually plug it in, and this is how he logs in and logs off with the mixed telematics device. But OmniTrax, you just use a login where you type in. PeopleNet, similar. You got a bunch of devices out there. So now what happens? Engine data goes into the system. Drivers interact with the system with the device in the truck, which is right here. They log in, and then they push buttons, right? At the same time, we're gathering location information. Once the log is developed through this data stream, it sends the log to the companies over here to interface and interact with the device. It sends it through the cloud. Now, how does it really work? The engine is what decides. Now, if a driver's logged in properly, the engine is what decides when the driver's in the driving status. So as long as the system is functioning correctly, the driver's logged in, he steps on the gas, 5 miles an hour, it will put him on line 3 driving. If he stops, the engine will say, hey, the vehicle stopped, and it will then await and want a status from the driver. The driver will either pick off-duty, sleeper berth, or on-duty, not driving. If he doesn't do anything, it will default to on-duty, not driving. So what do we have? We have a device that is automatically tracking driving time, but all the other duty statuses are not automatic. They're still, i.e., I'm using quotation marks with my fingers that you can't see, they're i.e. paper logs. A driver is still selecting off-duty, sleeper, or on-duty, just as they did with a paper log. The only difference with an ELD is now the driving line is automatic, connected to the engine, right? Now, every time a duty status changes with a paper log, the driver had to write in his city state. Now, satellite will generate the city state. So all of this information comes over to the company interface, and then the company can manage operational efficiencies. Nice now is you have asset tracking. You know how many hours the driver has. You don't have to call him on the phone. The driver will always have to tell the truth of how many hours he has because you have the interaction of the asset management on this end. So basically, this is how the data flows through the device, right? Now, how will you know it's an ELD or not? We know what the device is, and we have AOBRDs in one hand and ELDs in the other hand. Some devices out there are still AOBRDs. Now, as it relates to AOBRDs, there are some AOBRDs from a hardware perspective that won't meet the requirements. There are other AOBRDs that they have the correct hardware, they just need a software update. Once the software update comes through the cloud, then they will become ELDs. Now, is the government tracking all that? The answer is no. How do you get on this list of self-certified ELDs? It's, again, you self-certify. So there's over 100 vendors now in the United States. And how do they end up on the certified list in FMCSA's website? They basically say, I'm an ELD, and give them some information, and then they're on the list. The list also has revoked ELDs. The ELD mandate has specific processes on how to remove an ELD, but the process to put yourself on the list is a self-certification. I'll tell you now, some of the most well-known vendors in the United States have not self-certified yet because they're not 100% confident that they met all aspects. Partially, the government hasn't provided them all clear guidance. And the other thing is they're just not 100% sure they want to self-certify and then miss something. So ultimately, buyer beware. Don't just go on the self-certified list and assume everything is perfect, because if you do, you could actually have issues. So now we talked earlier, personal conveyance and yard moves. Personal conveyance and yard moves are two things that are not new in hours of service regulations. These things have been in place for as long as I remember being an inspector in reality, right? What is personal conveyance? Personal conveyance is driving a truck in off-duty status. I'll say it again. Driving a truck in off-duty status is personal conveyance. What's a yard move? A yard move is driving a truck on duty, not driving. What do you mean? Driving a truck when you're not driving? Yes. You can actually save on your 11 hours of driving or towards your 70-hour rule or not drive after the 14th if you are driving your truck on a yard. So now, two duty statuses that allow you to drive your truck without being on line 3, and these are the only two duty statuses, personal conveyance and yard miles. So now, what's personal conveyance? 395.8, question number 26, which is a guidance question in the regulation, has always outlined what personal conveyance is. This is the question. It says, that if a driver is relieved from all work and all responsibility for performing work, which is this first one, he operates short distances from en route lodging, motels, restaurants, etc., and he's not operating a laden CMV, he can use personal conveyance. So now, there are three things that make up personal conveyance where you can drive off duty. Number one, relieved of work, go short distance, and do not operate a loaded CMV. Now let's have a discussion about this in the industry that we have. A shipper is actually in a worse situation for personal conveyance than a receiver because a shipper loads an empty truck. So when they leave your facility, they're loaded, and you can't use personal conveyance. So that's number one. Receiver, generally you come loaded, you unload them, and they leave unladen. But they're going to be leaving with a truck and a trailer. There's a lot of discrepancy as to whether or not you can use personal conveyance with an empty trailer or not. I have guidance from FMCSA that says that you can under certain circumstances, but you have to not be performing any work or any responsibility for work. You have to go to lodging, like a truck stop or a restaurant or a hotel. You can't just go empty to the next shipper location because that's work, and it's not short distances to lodging and restaurants and places to get rest. Now, you could have an unladen CMV because there's no freight on there you're being compensated for. So motor carriers are starting to use personal conveyance at a higher and higher and higher level. Now, if you go back to the logs we talked about earlier, if you're a shipper and you hold them up for 5 hours, he's going to leave loaded. If you're a receiver and you hold him up for 5 hours, he could potentially use personal conveyance. But you'd have to have a trucking company that has relieved their driver from performing work. If the trucking company hasn't done that via like company policy, then you're potentially out of luck there too. So personal conveyance is driving off duty, and it is used more and more as it relates to ELDs. Again, it was in place with paper logs. Now, yard moves. What's a yard move? A yard move is driving while on duty not driving. So think of your facilities, everybody on the phone. You have a shipper's facility. There's a fence all the way around it. You have a gate shack where the guy checks drivers in and out, and the driver drives onto your facility that is completely secured. You can use yard moves if you are driving on a non-highway. This right here is the definition of a highway in the regulation. You can use yard moves if you are driving on a non-highway. So let's take your facility with a fence and a gate shack and a little gate thing where there's no access in there. Is that a road? No. Is it a street? No. But is it a way? Yes, it is a way that is passable by four-wheeled standard passenger cars. Well, my lot's on private property. Well, it doesn't matter because a road, street, or a way on private property that's passable by four-wheeled vehicles open to public travel is a highway. You mean to tell me that a parking lot at a gas station is a highway? And I'm going to tell you on the phone right now, yes. Is a gas station parking lot a way? Yup. Is it open to public travel? Yes. Is it public or private property? Yes. Is it passable by a four-wheeled car? Yes. So that public parking lot is a highway. Now, your facility that's gated and fenced in, all those things hold true except open to the public means it doesn't have restrictive gates. In your shipper location, you have restrictive gates, so then that's a non-highway. So you can use yard miles as a motor carrier. Now, yard moves still eats up your 14, still goes towards your 70-hour rule, but does not go towards your driving time. So a lot of drivers want to save on their driving time, so they'll use yard miles. Think about a driver. How does he make money? He makes money when his wheels spin around in circles because he's paid by the mile, right? So he wants to make as much money as possible. How does he do that? He saves as much driving time as possible. So yard moves will help him do that. Now we're going to talk about the out-of-service criteria. All right? The out-of-service criteria is a book that is brown, looks just like this. It comes out every April, and this one came out in 2017. The new one's coming out April 2018. The federal government, in the 2017 book, added 8 out-of-service criteria for ELDs, meaning if drivers get pulled over on the road or at a scale and they don't meet all the ELD requirements, there's 8 situations in which they would be placed out of service. Now, April of last year, they were actually going to make that out-of-service thing mandatory this December. Just recently in the news, they extended it, and they're going to go out to April 2018 now. So April 2018 is when this out-of-service criteria will go into effect. Now let's talk about that. Does that mean the industry has 3 more months? No, because if you get pulled over in December and you violate the ELD mandate, you're still going to get CSA violations, which are going to hurt your insurance. Brokers look at that. It's going to give you violations and get you tickets, right? The only thing it's going to do is it's not going to shut you down at the scale. All the out-of-service criteria does is allow you to continue to operate through April without a device. But every time you get pulled over, you're still going to get violated, get a ticket. It's going to hurt your CSA, hurt your insurance, hurt your litigation. Brokers aren't going to give you freight. Shippers don't want people that are violating. So, yes, there's an extension, but it's not an extension of the rule. It's just an extension of how they're going to enforce the rule, right? So let's go through these. A driver or carrier using one that's not on the list. Well, if you don't have an ELD that's on the list, it may be an AOBRD. So this first one is hard to violate if you have a device that still defaults to the AOBRD standards. Driver unable to produce or transfer data. This is interesting. With this new rule, officers on their laptops have a software program called ERODS. The officer will transfer a data file from the device we explained earlier to his laptop if he so sees fit, and upload it into the software program. So no matter whether you have, one of the 100 devices, the log will always look the same from the area of the driver, from the perspective of the inspector. So if you have an OmniTrax or a PeopleNet or a Mix or a GeoTab or whatever kind of device that you have, the officer will look at his computer and it'll all look the same. The other option the driver has is to just look at the display in the truck. But if a driver is unable to produce the file and transfer it to the officer at roadside, he's out of service as of April. Using an exempted category that you don't meet the exception. Maybe you had 10 days where you did not meet the 100 air mile radius in the last 30, then you don't get the exception, and they're going to say your log is false, and they're going to put you out of service starting in April. Fair to reconstruct your log. If the system malfunctions, you have to reconstruct with a paper log for the period of malfunction, right? If you don't do that, if they find any period in which the system failed in the last 7 days and you don't have a paper log, you're going to be out of service as of April. Fair to repair it within 8 days. This is kind of selecting a device, buyer beware. Some of these people are like starting a device out of their garage. If you're in Texas and it fails, you have to get a new device and get the one you have fixed within 8 days or request an extension from the division office in the state in which that motor carrier resides. I'll tell you, once you ask for an extension 1, 2, 3, 4 times, they're not going to give it to you no more. They're just going to say you picked the wrong device. So be careful. You have to fix ELDs within 8 days. If you don't, you're out of service in April. Fair to log in. Now, what is that? That's called an unidentified driver. If I'm driving, and this is a real-life example, if I'm driving down the road and I'm in Indianapolis at noon and my device says you have no hours left, but I log off the device and I drive to Chicago because I want to make my delivery. I'm now over hours, but I don't want my ELD to see that, so I log off in Indianapolis, drive to Chicago while logged off, then sleep for another 5-6 hours, get my 10-hour break, log back in and drive. That is illegal, but it does happen. It's called an unidentified driver. If you log off and drive and they catch you, you're going to be out of service April 2018. Required to have an ELD, but it doesn't have one. They pull you over, they say, where's your ELD? And you're like, I'm anti-government, I don't want an ELD. They're going to violate you this December, give you tickets, give you fines and penalties, but they're going to start placing you out of service in April. If in April you don't have one installed, you're going to have to get one installed at the scale going forward after April 1st. So now, we covered 8 things. The last one is you didn't get a false log would be you were out of service for 10 hours if you had no ELD, which is basically logging off and driving or having the wrong status other than driving. All right, so now, what can a broker do, right? What can a broker do? Well, we can actually require, meaning Siphon or any other broker can require ELDs in the vehicles by the December deadline. Now, how would a company like Siphon figure out whether a truck has an ELD or doesn't? This is a really good example. This is an example of a motor carrier that I'm aware of that has 500 trucks. Their violations over the last 2 years in CSA, everything that says 395.15 here is an AOBRD violation. You can see the majority of their violations are either form and manner, which is this top one, which you can have in an ELD, or it's ELD violations. One is recording device not available, blank set of logs, no instructions. So this company has had these violations in the last 2 years. The most frequent one was form and manner 7 times, and they have had an ELD for 2 years, which is clear when you look at the types of violations that they've had. Now, what are we talking about with instruction card? Every ELD needs to have an instruction card in the vehicle describing transfer mechanisms, what to do with a malfunction, and a user manual, right? You also need a blank set of logs. In case it malfunctions, you have to be able to fill out a paper log for the period of malfunction, which is not a service condition if you don't do it. Now, this is an example of a company with 150 trucks that does not have an AOBRD or ELD. There are no 395.15 violations here. 33 times the log wasn't current, 32 times for form and manner. Once you install these things, you'll see a lot less violations, as you see here. Now, if you look at false logs, which is one of the biggest problems in the industry, they only had 1 instance of false logs in 2 years with a company with 500 trucks. This company, false logs 12 times, of which 10 were out of service. So you see the varying difference. Come this December, a lot of the companies in the country, you're not going to see these type of violations anymore, which we go back to the beginning. Why are we doing this? We're doing this to save lives, right? So now, what can brokers do? A good broker will require ELDs. They're going to verify CSA. They're going to look at motor carriers that are best in class in the system and make sure the motor carriers they have in the system are ones that have put ELDs in place. Check previous violations. Once December comes, if some of our motor carriers at the good, legitimate brokers are seeing an uptick in the number of violations for no ELDs from our motor carrier partners, are we going to really think twice about giving them freight? Because they're like, well, the out-of-service condition isn't until April, so I'm not going to put them until April. If I get a ticket, so what? Well, I tell you, good brokers will say, no, we're pulling the plug on you now. We're not going to continue to let you violate just because it's not an out-of-service. Because failing to have an ELD with a crash, whether it's out of service or not, is still a violation that puts shippers and receivers in jeopardy. Train all people. Well, when I say all people, what are we talking about? Let's take Siphon right now, right? What are we doing at Siphon Logistics? We are training. We're training shippers and receivers right now. We have a series of webinars at the end of the month directed more towards motor carriers and what their challenges are and how they implement procedures. We're doing 3 of them at the end of the month. So we're training motor carriers. We're training shippers, receivers. We're training our internal staff. Our internal staff is going to pay attention to this information. Our internal staff are vetting through motor carriers to make sure that they are compliant with the ELDs. Plus, we have a legitimate resource going forward. If we train our internal staff at Siphon Logistics in a very good way so they're proactive, they can have answers to some of the questions you might not be able to find elsewhere. And if they don't have an answer, they can certainly reach out to me, 20-plus years experience in the transportation community, to get the answer that you so desire. All right, so now, we covered all this. We're ready, willing, and able to help you. We're now into the question and answer session, so I said I'd stay within 45 minutes, and I think we've been at about 43 minutes, so good for me for staying on task. So let's open this up to questions.
All right, I've got one here. It says, how do you choose an ELD vendor?
All right, so there are 2 aspects in choosing an ELD vendor in my mind. One is the driver, actually 3. Let's go with 3. The driver interface is 1. Your driver has to interact with it in the truck. So make sure that that is driver conducive, meaning it's a good for the driver. Number 2, choosing an ELD, motor carriers spend all their time on the interface. You could have a great device in the truck, but the interface is no good, meaning you can't even manage it real well because someone who developed the interface was some IT guy that doesn't even understand trucking. So make sure both of them are up to speed. Now, if I had a choice and one of them was less than the other, I would go with the interface over the driver interface in the truck. I would go with the company interface. The reason I would go with the company interface above and beyond the interface of the driver is because management is going to spend the majority of their time at that, and how do you manage a company safely? Using the driver interface. The last piece is, what else can you do with these? Temperature control, lane deviation technology, built-in camera systems, driver scorecards. Those are all additional things that you should consider. But don't just pull it off the list, because that's a self-certified list, buyer beware.
Great. Kim has asked another good question. She asked, what keeps a driver from having 2 ELDs in the truck?
All right. So, Kim, that is a very insightful question. And what she basically got on is this. There are 2 different devices. Some are hardwired devices where the computer is dedicated to be an ELD. There are also tablet and phone systems. It is illegal. I will preface this again. It is illegal. But can a driver put 2 different ELDs in their truck, meaning they have 2 pucks and 1 phone with 2 apps on their phone, and they run one device Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, the other device Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and when they get pulled over, they just tell the officer, hey, I just worked the last 4 days. And then the officer says, okay, wait a minute. We have an odometer jump. When you worked last week and then you started this week, you have an odometer jump where it shows an odometer went from one to the other. Who drove the truck those other 3 days? A driver could say, again, illegal, he could say, well, I have another driver that drives for me, which is a complete lie at roadside. If an investigator comes in and he's good at his job, he will detect that. Now, that would be buying 2 different devices. What stops you from running 2 logins with the same device? The header of an ELD now requires a driver's license number and the name of the driver. So at roadside, the officers are being trained to verify the driver's license number against, the person that's actually there. The system, the ELDs are not supposed to allow you to have 2 ELDs with the same driver's license number. But buyer beware, because you could have some of the systems, I've seen them, they allow you to have the same driver's license number as long as you put dashes in it. Now, to me, that's a bad vendor. The vendor should not allow for loopholes to get around and skirt what the mandate required. But they're out there. So great question, Kim.
All right, next question. How many driver coercion complaints have been filed against shippers since January 2016? And then it's got another question right past that. And what's the impact been?
All right, so far, there's been, to my knowledge, based on information that's presented to me, about 300 total since January 2016. Now, here's what I would say the impact is. Brokers in the United States of America vet motor carriers for safety. Why do they do that? They do that because they're afraid of the liability of hiring a bad motor carrier. So when I say liability, I really mean they're afraid of a lawsuit, right? Has a shipper been sued by a driver for forcing them to run over hours? I've read all the publications, like all these magazines. I'll say not yet. Will it happen? I would venture to guess that some driver is going to end up filing a lawsuit on a substantiated coercion rule complaint, and that shipper is potentially going to have to pay some kind of punitive damages for doing so. Once that happens, then I think the shipper community will take word of what I'm discussing. So has that happened? Not to my knowledge. Will it happen? I'll let you guess that. Do I think it's going to happen? Yes. I believe at some point some driver will win a lawsuit on a coercion rule complaint against a shipper.
All right. Next, Valerie asks, if you use brokers, would you advise some sort of clause in your contract with the broker requiring them to make sure that the carriers and independents that they use are ELD compliant?
I would say if it were me, yes. I want the brokers to do something to try to give me the safest motor carriers possible. Now, that something could be monitoring CSA scores to see if there's a high tendency of ELD violations. looking at their ratings, which is a whole nother topic of how companies get rated, which is a flawed system, but we won't get into that because this isn't a rating webinar, right? But you could look at their rating, you could look at their CSA scores, you could look at the types of violations on CSA. You could also make motor carriers sign a clause saying, yes, I agree, I'll put 100% in there, because then during litigation, at least the broker has something where the carrier committed to it, and then they can protect you that you vetted through to try to make sure you have a broker of choice. Now, I think the best brokers in the country are already going down that road. Smaller brokers, maybe not so much, because they have to keep their motor carrier base running.
Okay, Randy asks, what to do in the case that late fees are being imposed by receivers because the shippers are held the drivers, causing them not to have enough hours to make delivery on time?
All right, so now, the federal government, nor me, nor even brokers will generally, well, brokers could, but we're not getting into late fees or non-late fees. But let's talk about the regulation in the ELD. If drivers are no longer able to accommodate shippers by covering up these delays in their logs, i.e. having false logs, covering up for the shippers, what will end up happening? We have a driver shortage. We have a potential capacity crunch, meaning there's less hours per driver after the ELD mandate. Who is in a position of power at that point? The driver. Because if you have supply and demand, what's the smallest supply? The number of hours each driver has and the number of drivers, quite frankly, right? So if you're a shipper and you're known to hold guys up, you're going to end up paying more fees. You're going to end up wanting a truck there, and you may not have one there because the truck drivers and the motor carriers are going to gravitate towards shippers that are more accommodating. So there is no regulatory guidance regarding late fees. Shippers and receivers, if you want to be a good one, you should truly take the consideration and a second look at that and be more accommodating to the drivers than adding fees to them, because then what's going to happen is you're not going to be a shipper of choice and you're going to end up with higher rates. Me as a trucking company, I would rather go to a shipper that can get me in and out and get me 2 loads a day than a ship can get me 1 load a day. I'm willing to take less money knowing I get in and out of there, because then my overall revenue and my overall stream of profit is higher than just taking a higher rate for 1 load a day. And then who's paying a higher rate with late fees and everything else? That other shipper.
All right, another question. How might ELDs change the way shippers and 3PLs and carriers interact?
Well, I'll say this. I have been at FMCSA and working regulatory stuff in the trucking side. Now, just so we get on the phone, we understand. We have drivers on one end, then we have motor carriers, then we have brokers, then we have shippers and receivers. In my 20-plus years, only in the last 6 months have I been doing training to brokers, shippers, and receivers. The first 20-plus years, no broker, no shipper, no receiver ever asked me to give them guidance on hours of service and the coercion rule and what faces a driver and how the ELD will impact. So this ELD in itself is broadening and opening up the communication between that. I can, Greg, you can speak for this. Have you ever done a webinar to shippers and receivers regarding the challenges of a motor carrier and the regulations that they may face from FMCSA? Probably not, right?
No.
And we are now, and we're doing it because we want to be proactive. So I think that's bridging the gap.
Great, and I think the last question is what are some of the benefits shippers might derive from the ELDs?
Well, I'll tell you, operational efficiencies is a big one. Operational efficiencies. In the past, companies that didn't have ELDs were ultimately relying on drivers to say how many hours they have left. Now, a trucking company with 30 trucks, he knows exactly where his truck is. He knows if it's loaded or unloaded. He knows how many hours they have left, and he knows where they're going. So motor carriers themselves will become more efficient. So even though we may have less capacity and we may have less drivers because of a driver shortage, we're going to increase operational efficiencies because data is power. And what we're doing is we're now increasing the amount of data we have, and that right there will give shippers and receivers power, right? So now again, if you could check driver hours of service either directly through brokers or carrier relationships, or when they come on your lot. Have them flip their screen around and check their hours of service. See how many hours they have left so you can be efficient in getting them in and out of there, reducing your coercion rule liability and increasing overall efficiencies in this logistics change nationwide. I tell you, you can only do what you can do. And I challenge everybody to go on that's on the phone, go back to your facilities, go back to your companies, and develop driver operational efficiency procedures. Train your dock workers, train your forklift guys, train your gate shack guys on how to be efficient as it relates to that driver, because they're as important to your operation. And so the motor carrier driver is as important to your operation as your forklift driver or your dock worker or your gate guy.
All right, Kim has asked one last question. I want to throw it in there. I think it's a good one. She asked, how does the ELDs work with team driving?
All right. So team driving is this. I told you that driving time is automatically recorded. I'll say it again. Driving time is automatically recorded as long as you're logged in and the device is working right. You cannot edit driving time at all unless you have a team. So if you have a team and you're both logged in at the same time, this is how it works, you're logged in at the same time, you designate one driver as the active driver, meaning he's the one driving. You designate the other driver as the inactive driver, right? If they forget to switch the status of active versus inactive, they can actually edit their driving time later. But now, as it relates to the hours of service, a properly run team operation should be able to drive without stopping that truck up until the point they get to their 70-hour rule. Meaning one driver can drive for 10, 11, while the other one sleeps for 10, 11. Then they switch, and that truck will never have to stop moving. So I'll tell you, the flexibility in keeping a truck moving is an interesting dynamic with the ELD. But two drivers, just to answer your question, two drivers will log in at the same time. One will be active, one will be inactive. They can edit their driving time if they make a mistake. That's the only case. One other caveat to team driving is instead of sitting in the sleeper for 10 straight hours, a driver that is not active can sit in the sleeper for 8 straight hours and then sit in the passenger seat for 2 to get his 10-hour break. So there is some flexibility there. The only problem is drivers want to make X amount of dollars. And even though the one truck can move without stopping up until the point you get to your 70, the total amount of revenue you can make as a team driver is actually less than a single driver in the up until this ELD point. So I hope that answers your question.
Awesome job, John. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you for your insightful questions. I want to let everybody know that this copy of this will be on our website. And again, if you have any other questions, you can get a hold of me, and I will put you in touch with John directly, free of charge. That concludes our webinar. Thank you.